Evening, everybody. Time to read from another chapter of a book. This time around, as we started yesterday, it's The Kraken's Curse, which is my novel that I wrote when I was 16. So this is coming up for 12 years old or more than that at the moment. And these readings are going to be a lot shorter than the other ones were because the chapters are a lot shorter. So we're going to read chapters 3 and 4 tonight. Chapter 3. Attack from the Past. It was midnight. The stars shone in the sky above the hillside. As it travelled slowly across the crescent moon, the darkness pierced the cold air as if to push away any glint of happiness that remained. Under the hedgerow something moved, something stirred. Amongst the branches of frosting blackberries, a fox darted above and below, in and out. As he moved, he made sure not to pierce any part of his silvery grey fur on the parting branches, which were placed higgledy-piggledy in mismatched patterns, some high and some low. There were many different varieties of forest creature making their homes amongst the berry bushes on this particular night, for this was a night in the deepest throes of winter, when animals made a dash for their nests in order to escape the farthest reaches of the cold. But for most people, to see a fox beneath the hedgerows on such a night would be very strange indeed. After all, most of the forest kingdom would be tucked up asleep by this time in the season. Perhaps this particular creature had been subjected to some cruel joke, or had witnessed a bout of countrywide deforestation. There was no time to decipher which of these, if any, the animal had been through. Something far worse was brewing. Something sinister and non-chivalrous was poking its dark shoulder over the hill, a shadow of a being. Just as quickly as he had arrived, the silver fox stealthily made his way back through the maze of leaves and into the relative safety of the darkness. The being was moving now, its shadow growing longer by the minute, and as it made its way towards the top of the hill, it seemed to take a maliciously evil form that glowed in the moonlight. It was drawing slow, rapid breaths in and out. Soon enough, or from the fox's perspective what seemed like an eternity, a strangely shaped translucent head appeared over the crest of the hill. The arms of the being came next, quickly wrapping themselves around a sleeping tree and pulling it cleanly from its tangled roots, like a boat upon the sea in high winds. Everything suddenly went black. Pitch black. Any glimpse of light which may have been reflected off the moon now vanished when it arrived within a distance of the valley below. This took the fox by surprise, as although he was hiding in the shadows of the bushes, he was still watching the being with eager eyes and found it very irritating that it had taken the liberty to turn out all of the lights. Maybe it enjoys hiding under the cover of darkness, the fox thought, imagining the character cowering away in the dark. Maybe it needs protection. It might have been these thoughts that spurred the fox on, or the distinct smell of fear in the air. But whatever it was, something entered the fox's mind and sprang him out of the safe hiding place in which he had been waiting. It was at this point that the silvery wisp of a character noticed something. It raised itself to full height, which was quite easy in the darkness, and it moved its arms slowly in each direction to sense any movement in the valley. Immediately it knew that someone or something was emitting a powerful aurora. This was no normal creature. This being had found precisely what it was looking for. Quickly, it jeered its head and let out a piercing laugh that echoed around the valley like a church bell on the steeple. Then, without any intake of breath, the being shrieked, but this time it turned into an ear-piercing rasp. It was speaking. "Bring him to me!" The silver fox darted for cover. How silly he had been. What had made him run from his safety? His thoughts were short and his hair on the back of his head stood on end. The being was speaking again, and this time it was angry. "Bring him to me," it rasped with an evil sneer. "Bring the silver fox to me." A searing pain pierced his small head. He tried hard to shout, but he couldn't. Thoughts were entering his mind, horrible thoughts. There were thoughts of a future locked up in a cage, and thoughts of a future being hunted for fun. He opened his mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Then, without thinking, he ran. Away from the hedgerows and upwards across the hard ground, towards the top of the hill. His legs were aching and his head was pounding. Words were beating in his ears, words of evil and fear. Someone was laughing and jeering, but he could no longer remember whom. "That's right, little creature, come to me." The fox tried to block it out, but at the top of the hill, as it got nearer, the jeering got louder and more sinister. "You are forest scum. I've waited in my prison for you. I've waited to get my own back from the spells you cast and the trouble you caused. But I found you. hiding in a darkened forest on the edge of my world. I tell you, I couldn't have picked an easier situation if I tried." Then with one last rasping breath, the fox heard words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Who's more powerful now, George Boston?" These were the words that rang all around before dying away. The valley fell silent. The fox had stopped running and had fallen to the ground. His legs were aching, telling his body that he was still moving. The moon reappeared so suddenly, as if someone had switched on the lights. Both the fox and the being were now visible, and as he dared to move his eyes upwards, the pain in his head disappeared. Instead, it was replaced by a bright blindness before him. The whole landscape was melting. The valley was disappearing into a white light. The being was screaming, but its rasping tone was disappearing. Above the blindness, above the noise, the fox couldn't help thinking he was safe, for now. There had been a divine intervention here. He was alive for one reason only. His magic survived, the spells he had cast remained, but there was something else. He could sense someone had been laden with the burden of defeating this great creature. His powers had been passed on. And it was, at that split second, that the silver fox realised that he might be locked in this form for all eternity. Chapter 4. Village Mysteries. At sunrise the next morning, the small desolate cottage that stood high upon the darkened cliffs became visible above the roaring of the grey-tinted sea. Somewhere from within the darkness of the stone, a blotch of colour became clearly visible, as the grey blinds were withdrawn from the lead panes that encased them, and the brightly coloured curtains were revealed behind. Smoke slowly started to billow from the ruined chimney on the top of the house. The door was prized open, and the young man, now wearing a pinstriped suit, emerged from the front to collect the bread and milk that had been kindly delivered from the village below. It would have been obvious to a trained eye that this young man, who had only days earlier been strolling along the blackened beaches of Poole Harbour, did not belong here. His accent was not right, his hair, his clothes, and the way he walked did not keep in with the fine standards that were upheld by the villagers and the residents of the surrounding area. But whether in a bid to blend in, or to prolong what was bound to happen anyway, he returned to the house and reached for his razor. The flick of the switch set the whirring shark's teeth into action, up and down the sharpness of his cheeks until all was clean and shaven. At least now he had some chance of looking respectable. For the second time that morning, the young man reached for his satchel, entered the cold sea air, and pulled the door closed on the latch behind him. Just behind him on the wall was a sign. It could only be read when the door was closed, and it had been scribbled over several times in the past. The name Rev. James Tindersley had long since been and gone, and now in fine red ink it bore the words Arthur Boston, NSF. Walking towards the rocky path that led to the village, Arthur Boston noticed something strange about the shoreline. Although it was only a small settlement, the marina on the edge of the beach was usually packed full with fishing and tourist boats, but today it was empty and there were no boats to be seen. As the houses drew nearer and nearer, Arthur Boston could tell that it could not only be the marina that was empty. The streets looked depressing and bare too. Nobody ventured outside their front doors this morning. The cobbles were not lively anymore, and although he was a solitary person, something still felt wrong. Arthur missed the villagers, and he suddenly realised that his efforts to clean and smarten himself up had probably been in vain. He paused though, once he reached the familiar sight of the village shop. It seemed a good idea to collect something for lunch that day, for he did not know how long he was going to be out for. The open sign was in the window, and so that was all well and good, but when he pushed the door, it was locked shut. "Well, this is just typical," he muttered. "Something weird is going on. Something I don't understand and won't wait round to discover more about." And with that he took off at a pace towards the bottom of the street. On his way down he noticed that even the village pub was closed. But today was a Monday, and without fail they always had a delivery. At the bottom of the road, just below the pub, Arthur happened upon a very strange phenomenon indeed. It was so strange, in fact, that he couldn't help himself from stopping and pondering over it a little longer. There before him was a bird. It looked very much like a swallow, in mid-flight. To see a bird in flight was not such a surprising thing, but this particular creature appeared to be frozen in time. It intrigued Arthur greatly, and he paced around the bird several times before submitting it to something he could not understand. The bird was just above his head, but he could touch it with the tips of his fingers. But why was it frozen in the moment? He just did not know. Intrigued by what he had seen, and even a little scared, Arthur couldn't help wondering what or who had stopped time and caused everything he had witnessed on his journey through the village. In the rush to leave behind the strange occurrences, however, he had completely forgotten what he had set out to do. By now he had passed the marina and reached an empty field at the bottom of a hill, one which looked out to sea. A large expanse of the field was empty, but in the furthest corner there stood a small stone cottage, not unlike his own upon the cliff edge. Venturing towards the left of the fence, he reached for the lock on the side of the gate. Metal clicked against metal as he pulled back the bolt and crossed the field boundary. He immediately headed for the small cottage, and when he approached he rapped 3 times on the small wooden door. It was a knock that showed authority and proved that he had arrived. Footsteps could be heard from inside. Someone was moving towards the door and they had very heavy breathing. Suddenly the door was flung backwards, nearly hitting Arthur in the face, and there stood a tall man who obviously had to stoop a great deal to enter and exit his own dwelling. He wore a long red robe and had neatly shortened hair. Arthur was surprised, to say the least. This was not at all how his father had described his friend Horace at all. "Who is it? Who's there?" the man spat in a gruff voice. It was at that point that he looked down with a strange glint in his eye and noticed a young man standing on his doorstep. His tone of voice changed. "Oh my, what a surprise this is," he smiled. "Welcome, Arthur, welcome. Of course I knew it wouldn't take long before you came seeking guidance. Come inside, make yourself at home, and please help yourself to tea and biscuits." So there's chapter 3 and 4 of my novel, The Kraken's Curse. We will be back tomorrow night with chapters 5 and 6. I really hope that you can join me tomorrow night.